Let's go over a summary over what we learned so far. Let's first go over specific examples when we multiplied positive or negative 3 and positive or negative 5. We learned that 3 times 5 is equal to 5 plus 5 plus 5 using repeating addition, which is 15. We learned that 3 times negative 5 is equal to negative 5 plus negative 5 plus negative 5, which is equal to negative parentheses 5 plus 5 plus 5, which is equal to negative parentheses 3 times 5, which is equal to negative 15. We also learned that negative 3 times 5 is equal to negative 5 minus 5 minus 5, which is equal to negative parentheses 5 plus 5 plus 5, which is equal to negative parentheses 3 times 5, which is equal to negative 15. Negative 3 times negative 5 is equal to 5 plus 5 plus 5, which is equal to 3 times 5, which is equal to 15. So both 3 times 5 and negative 3 times negative 5 are positive, and 3 times negative 5 and negative 3 times 5 are negative. Now let's go over general for both multiplying and dividing because they have the same rules for positive and or negative numbers. Positive and positive result in positive. Positive and negative result in negative. Negative and positive result in negative. And lastly, negative and negative result in positive. So how do I remember these rules when I multiply or divide positive and or negative numbers? One way of thinking is that like signs are ultimately positive answers. For example, positive and positive, so they both have the plus sign before them, will result in an answer that is positive. Negative and negative would result in an answer that is positive. Different signs means that the answer will be ultimately negative, that the product, that is the answer after multiplying, or that the quotient, that is the answer after dividing, would be ultimately negative. For example, if I have positive and negative, the answer would be negative. If I have negative and positive, the answer would be negative because those have different signs. Another way you can think about this is that if you are multiplying or dividing a positive number, keep the answer as either positive or negative the same. For example, if I have positive and positive, the latter positive would not change, that the answer will be ultimately positive from the first positive. If I have negative and positive, the latter positive would not change, that the answer would be negative. When you are multiplying or dividing a negative number, switch the answer to the opposite of what you originally had, a positive or negative. For example, if I had positive negative, the negative would switch the positive over to the opposite, which is negative, and the answer would be negative. If I had negative negative, the latter negative would switch the original negative to the opposite, and the answer would be positive. Later, there'll be more examples that will better explain these ways of thinking. Also, I'll share a shortcut way of thinking about if the answer is ultimately positive or negative if you have tons of positive and negative numbers to multiply or divide. Both of these ways of thinking that we covered in the last slide are the same ideas for when you add or subtract positive and or negative numbers. However, for adding and subtracting, you care what operation you're ultimately doing, but for multiplying and dividing, you care if the final answer will be positive or negative. Also, for adding and subtracting, the signs are adjacent to each other, but for multiplying and dividing, the signs are before each number, and they indicate if it's positive or negative. In the next slide, we'll go over examples to better explain the similarities and differences for multiplying or dividing and adding or subtracting. Now let's illustrate what I meant for the differences between multiplying and dividing and adding and subtracting for positive and negative numbers, and also the similarities. So here's for adding and subtracting, and here's for multiplying and dividing. Suppose I have 3 plus negative of, positive of, negative 7. I would like to see what operation will sum up all of these plus, minus, minus, plus, minus, minus. Will they ultimately be adding or ultimately be subtracting? Also to note is that all of these signs are adjacent to each other. They are next to each other. So now let's simplify all of these signs. Let's do it 2 at a time. So plus, minus. There's 2 ways of thinking about this. First way is that these are different signs, and so that would mean minus. The other way of thinking is that the second minus sign would mean opposite of the first operation, and the opposite of plus is minus. So either way, you get 3 minus. Now let's work on minus, minus. You can think similar signs, a plus sign, or you can think that the second minus sign means the opposite for the first operation, which is minus, and the opposite of minus is plus. Now let's do plus, plus. So you can think that similar signs means plus, or you can think that the second plus sign means do the same as the first operation, which is the plus sign. And the same thing as plus is plus. And now you have plus, minus. You can think that they are different operations, which means minus, or you can think that the second operation, which is the minus sign, means to do the opposite from the first operation, and the opposite of plus is minus. And lastly, we have minus, minus. You can think that these are the same operation, and that would mean plus, or you can think that the second minus sign means to do opposite of the first minus sign, and the opposite of minus is plus. So you end up with 3 plus 7, which is 10. Our example for multiplying or dividing shall be positive 5 times negative 7 times negative 5 times positive 2 times negative 3 times negative 6. The signs are the same and in the same order as the adding or subtracting example. Also to note is that the signs are before each number rather than right next to each other. And also you want to find out if it's ultimately positive or ultimately negative. So first we have a positive and then a negative. So you can think that different signs means negative, or you can think that the second sign is negative, which means to do opposite of the first sign, which is positive, and the opposite of positive is negative. Then we have negative, negative. You can think that same signs means to do positive, or you can think that the second sign is negative, which means to do opposite of the first sign, and opposite of negative is positive. Then we have positive, positive. So you can think that similar signs means positive, or you can think that the second sign is positive, which means to do the same as the first sign, which is positive, and same thing as positive is positive. Then we have positive, negative. You can think that different signs means negative, or you can think that the second sign is negative, which means to do the opposite of the first sign, which is positive. And the opposite of positive is negative. Lastly, we have negative, negative. So you can think that similar signs means to do positive, or you can think that the second sign is negative, which means to do the opposite of the first sign, and the opposite of negative is positive. So we end up with a positive number, which is 6,300. So what if I want a shortcut? What if I want to know if I'm ultimately adding, ultimately subtracting, ultimately have a positive number, ultimately have a negative number, without going step by step? If I have an even number of minus signs, that means if I have a number of minus signs that is a multiple of 2, I am ultimately adding, if the example would fall under adding or subtracting, or I have ultimately a positive answer if I'm multiplying or dividing. If you can think that you have a whole number of pairs of minus pairs, because you have an even number of minus signs. The number of minus signs you have is a multiple of 2. You can group up these minus pairs, and each of these minus sign pairs can be summarized as positive, each one of them, because for each pair you have minus, minus, negative, negative. And that means you have the same signs. So we summarized all the minus signs as positive. What you're left with are positive signs. So that means that what you have in total is all positive signs, and that would summarize as positive. You can also think that if you have an even number of minus signs, you're undoing itself. So you can think minus going one way, and then opposite of that is positive, and you're doing that an even number of times, so you'll end up back where you started. If you have an odd number of minus signs, you're ultimately subtracting if you're adding or subtracting, or you have an ultimately a negative answer if you're multiplying or dividing. From the odd number of minus signs, you can subtract an even number of minus signs and end up with 1 minus sign. So what you're left with is 1 negative sign and a bunch of positive signs. Because there is nothing to cancel out the negative sign, you will be ultimately subtracting, ultimately have a negative answer. Thanks for watching this set of videos. I hope that you enjoyed them.